The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the last damp miles traversed by a boy on a pony. It bore the inscription of a hand so ancient yet so steady that Selena Radam knew, even before she broke the seal, it belonged to a woman who had never in her life been denied anything she truly desired. She stood by the window of her 2 rented rooms, where the light was best, to read it. Candles were a luxury, and she had learned to structure her days around the fleeting gift of daylight. The letter was from the Dowager Duchess of Elmsford, a woman she had never met. It was concise, it was direct. It offered no preamble of flattery, the sort great ladies often bestowed upon those they intended to employ. It stated that the Dowager had learned from a mutual acquaintance that Mrs. Radam possessed a keen intellect, discretion, and an uncommon degree of good sense, that she was a widow, self-supporting, and beholden to no one. It continued that the grand estate at South Tarn, nestled in the northern fells, had been shuttered and left to languish for the better part of a decade. Its library was succumbing to decay, its rooms lay draped in protective cloths, its accounts were in a state the Dowager described only as appalling, and in the final line, a line Selena reread thrice, it explained that the house had been allowed to fall into ruin because its owner had first fallen into ruin himself. The Dowager, too old and too distant, could mend neither. She sought someone who could. A postscript followed, penned in the same resolute hand. It read, "My son does not know I am writing to you. He will not thank me. Come regardless." Selena Radam was 31 years old. In the 7 years since her husband's ship had vanished off a coast she'd never seen, she had learned that a woman without fortune or protector had precisely 2 commodities to offer: her labor and her judgment. The latter, she knew, was worth far more than the former, provided she found someone discerning enough to recognize its value. She had been the wife of a naval captain. That is to say, she had managed a household and a small estate alone for extended periods while he was at sea. Then, alone for good, when the sea claimed him permanently. She kept accounts with a proficiency that surpassed most businessmen. She was fluent in 3 languages. She had tended the sick and buried the dead, bartered with merchants, and stood her ground against a bishop. She had accomplished all of this without ever being seen to weep in public, for she had understood early on that a woman who displays her grief publicly invites others to assume dominion over her. She didn't desperately need the Dowager's wealth. She possessed a modest income, managed with careful frugality, which provided her with 2 clean rooms, simple meals, and the liberty to refuse work that offended her sensibilities. But she was bored. It was the specific, gnawing tedium that afflicts a capable individual with no purpose, and she was curious. The final line of the letter had struck a chord deep within her, a chord she didn't examine too closely. A man in ruin, a house abandoned for a decade, a mother too proud to utter the word help until the postscript, and then only obliquely. She penned her reply that very afternoon, accepting the offer and stating her terms with unvarnished clarity, making no concessions. A woman who compromises on her terms has already begun to falter. The Dowager's reply, when it arrived, agreed to every point and added a single sentence that almost drew a smile from Selena in the solitude of her rooms. It read, "I knew you would be suitable. Those who dictate their terms are the only ones truly worth having." And so it was that on a biting afternoon at the very close of winter, with the light already fading by 4 o'clock, Selena Radam finally arrived at South Tarn and beheld the house that seemed a reflection of the man within. The fells loomed, vast and somber, on all sides, their higher reaches still dusted with lingering snow. The road snaked up a long, shadowed valley, tracing the course of an iron-hued river, and at the valley's apex, where the land leveled before ascending once more, lay a tarn, a small, profound mountain lake, black and utterly still beneath the failing light, mirroring the slate-gray sky. The house stood sentinel above the tarn. It had once been a grand dwelling, and its essential structure remained noble, but it wore its neglect like a proud man wears his destitution. Everywhere and nowhere, in the sightless, shuttered windows, on the moss-clad north walls, amid the weeds standing dead in the drive. Half the chimneys stood cold. The gardens had surrendered to the moor. It was the dwelling of a man who had stopped 10 years prior and had never begun again, and it rested above its black, placid tarn like a creature holding its breath. Selena gazed at it for a long moment from the carriage window. She felt no dismay, perhaps anticipated by the dowager. Instead, she experienced the quiet thrum of a capable person presented with a significant and worthwhile task. The house was not dead. She could discern that even from the road. It was merely waiting. Houses, much like people, can endure long periods of waiting. She was greeted by the housekeeper, a gaunt, anxious woman named Mrs. Peel, who had clearly not expected to be tending to a household ever again. The hall lay draped. The grand staircase ascended into darkness. A dust sheet had slipped from a mirror, and Selena caught a glimpse of her own reflection, travel-worn and somber, and thought that she and the house were a fitting pair, both worn and in waiting. "His Grace keeps to the old wing," Mrs. Peel murmured, as though the very words might be overheard and punished. "He does not dine with company. He does not receive guests. He will not have known you were coming, ma'am. The dowager will not have informed him." She twisted her apron. "You'll forgive me for saying so, but the last 3 ladies the dowager sent, not one of them lasted the week. The cold and the quiet and his grace. It's not an unkind house, ma'am. It's simply a house that has forgotten how to have people in it. Then it will remember," Selena said, peeling off her damp gloves. "Houses do, eventually. I have traveled since dawn, and I would appreciate a fire and something warm to drink, and to see the full extent of what I have undertaken before I sleep, so that I do not lie awake imagining it to be worse than it is. Which room is the library?" Mrs. Peel regarded her as if she had inquired about the path to the moon. Then, slowly, a flicker of apprehension on her face softened, the way a servant's expression often does when a clear purpose emerges after a long absence. Someone who plainly intends to take charge. "This way, ma'am," she said. "Mind the 3rd step. It's been threatening to give way for a year, and no one has had the heart to mend it." "We shall mend it on Thursday," Selena declared, and followed her into the gloom. That first evening, she saw the worst of it, as she had requested, and the worst was truly dire. Mrs. Peel led her through room after shrouded room by candlelight, and everywhere the story was the same: dampness and chill, and coverings grayed by a decade of dust. Fine furniture warped, delicate plaster crumbled, a grand house dying by inches for want of someone to care whether it lived. Selena did not exclaim. She withdrew a small notebook from her pocket and made notations, room by room, in her precise hand, much as she might have once inventoried a ship's stores. A house, like a ship, is salvaged by an inventory before it is saved by anything else. You cannot repair what you have not first catalogued. They finally reached a long, dark corridor in the old wing, and Mrs. Peel stopped, refusing to go further. "His Grace is beyond there," she whispered. "We do not venture beyond there, unless he summons us." Selena peered down the shadowed corridor. She understood that somewhere at its end, a man sat alone in the cold, just as he had sat alone in the cold for 10 years, and that the entire vast, decaying house had arranged itself around that single point of grief, much like a body cradles a wound. She did not proceed down the corridor, but she paused for a moment, gazing into it, and she thought, not with pity, but with the plain, practical resolve that guided all her actions, that a house cannot be saved while its heart remains still. She had been hired to save the house. The 2 tasks were, therefore, 1. Regardless of what the dowager had chosen to call them. She slept that night in a cold, clean room that Mrs. Peel had aired for her, under more blankets than she was accustomed to. She did not lie awake imagining the work to be worse than it was, because she had seen it plainly, and knew precisely how bad it was, and knowing a thing clearly is the surest antidote to fearing it. She awoke before dawn, as was her habit, dressed in the dark, and stepped out to survey the house alone in the nascent gray light. That was how she came to the library, and to the man in the chair. She met the master of the house the following morning, and she met him by accident, which was, in fact, the only way anyone ever met him. She had risen early, as was her custom, and had set out to explore the house alone in the cool dawn light. Assessing the scope of the task, she opened a door she mistook for another shrouded parlor, only to discover the library. The library, the very one the dowager had declared was rotting. She stood on the threshold, genuinely distressed. It was a magnificent room, and it was dying. Damp had seeped into the north wall. Books stood swollen and spotted on the shelves, entire collections beyond repair. The grand globe in the corner had cracked along its meridian. The scent of the room was the smell of slow decay, of mold and cold ash and neglect. Selena Radam loved books with a devotion akin to a woman's love for children, an unconditional and uncalculated passion. The sight of a grand library left to ruin moved her more profoundly than the dilapidated house. She stepped inside without a second thought, moved to the worst of the shelves, and drew out a damaged volume with a soft sound of sorrow. "Leave it," a voice commanded from the shadows by the cold hearth. "There is no one to read them." She turned. A man sat in the dimness of the far corner. He was ensconced in a deep armchair, its back angled towards the gray window, rendering him a mere silhouette against the light, nothing more. She realized instantly that he had been there before she entered, in the cold and the dark, that he occupied that chair often, and that it was positioned deliberately so that anyone entering would see his outline, not his face. She had been warned. The dowager had not described him, but Mrs. Peel had let slip a few frightened words, and Selena had understood. The scar, the war, the 10 years. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied. For whatever else he might be, he was a duke, and she possessed good manners. "I am Mrs. Radam. Your mother engaged me to attend to the house and the books. I did not intend to disturb you, but I am glad to have found you, as I have a great many questions, and it is far easier to ask them of a man than of a frightened housekeeper." There was a silence. She sensed he was unaccustomed to being addressed as though he were an ordinary man with ordinary business, and that the experience was not entirely welcome. "My mother," he said at last, his voice low and hard, "had no right to engage anyone. This house is not to be interfered with. You may consider your engagement terminated. Mrs. Peel will ensure you are compensated for your trouble and your journey. There is an inn at the foot of the valley. The carriage can take you down before darkness falls." "It cannot," Selena replied. "The carriage departed this morning. I saw it go, and I have signed an agreement with the Dowager Duchess, witnessed and sealed, which I will not break. A woman who breaks her agreements is not worth employing. So I am afraid you are stuck with me, Your Grace, at least until the terms are met or bought out. And I should tell you plainly that I am expensive to buy out. I named my terms high on the theory that any man reduced to hiring a stranger to save his library had better be able to afford her. It was not meant as a jest. She was simply stating the truth, as she told everyone the truth, having discovered long ago that honesty saved a great deal of time. But something stirred within the shadowed form by the window. A stillness, and then a sound she could not at first identify, so brief and so rough, it was almost a cough. She understood only afterward that it had been the ghost of a laugh. The memory of one, a laugh that had caught halfway out of a man who had forgotten he owned one and been strangled before it could finish. He rose. He came a step out of the shadow into the gray light and let her see him. She understood that he did it deliberately, as a kind of test, or a kind of cruelty to himself to watch her flinch. She did not flinch. He was tall and raven dark, and would have been a handsome man once in the hard aristocratic way. Down the left side of his face, from the cheekbone to the line of the jaw, ran the long silvered seam of an old saber cut, a cavalry wound, 10 years healed. It pulled the corner of his mouth very slightly out of true, and had taken the ease from that whole side of his face so that it no longer moved as a face should. His eyes were a clear, cold slate blue. They were fixed on her with a still and terrible attention, waiting for the thing that always came, the widening, the quick glance away, the softening into pity, or the hardening into distaste. Selena looked at the scar because it would have been an insult not to. Then she looked at the man, and she said in the same plain voice, "That was a cavalry saber. I think my husband was a naval man, but I have nursed enough soldiers to know the marks. It was well stitched considering. You were fortunate in your surgeon. Most men in that war were not." He said nothing, so she went on, because she would not begin their acquaintance by pretending not to see what stood in front of her. "It is a hard thing to carry on the face," she said, "where everyone must see it and no one may mention it. I imagine that is the worst of it. Not the wound, the not being allowed to speak of it, so that it sits in every room like a fourth person no one will name." He stared at her for a long moment. He did not speak at all. She thought perhaps she had gone too far, as she sometimes did, for she had never learned the trick of leaving true things unsaid. And then the Duke of Elmsford said very low, in a voice gone strange, "No one has said that to me in 10 years. "Then everyone you know is a coward," said Selena. "Or too kind, which comes to the same thing in the end." She turned back to the shelf. "Now, the north wall of this library is letting in water. Half these books are past saving, but only half. The other half can be saved if we begin today. I shall need braziers and clean cloths and every strong pair of hands in the house for a week. May I have them, or shall we let the rest rot to spite your mother?" He gave her the hands and the braziers and the cloths. He told himself it was only because it was easier than arguing, and because she would be gone within the month in any case, driven out by the cold and the silence, as everyone was driven out. He did not examine why he had come out of the shadow and let her see his face. He did not examine why her failure to flinch had left him feeling for the rest of that gray day as though something long frozen had shifted a fraction, the way ice shifts on a tarn in the first thaw, with a sound like a distant shot. Dominic, Duke of Elmsford, had not always been the man in the dark chair. He remembered, though he tried not to, the man he had been before Spain, a young officer of cavalry with more spirit than sense, who laughed easily and often, who rode and danced and courted, and believed in the shallow, untried way of the young, that the world was a thing arranged for his pleasure. That man had gone to the war in the peninsula because it was the fashion and the duty of his kind, and he had discovered there what such men discover, that the world is arranged for no one's pleasure, that courage is not what one imagines, that the men one commands will die on one's orders, in numbers, in the mud, and go on dying in one's sleep for the rest of one's life. He had taken the saber cut in a cavalry action on a hot Spanish afternoon. He remembered almost nothing of the blow itself, only the strange lack of pain, and the blood in his eye, and the fact that the man beside him, a boy of 19 named Timms, whom he had promised the boy's mother to look after, had taken the same stroke a moment later, and had not risen. He had come home with half his face and none of his laughter and a company of ghosts. He had come to South T, the remotest of his houses, and he had shut the door. He had not meant it to be 10 years. No man means a thing to be 10 years. It happens a day at a time, each day a little easier to stay shut than to open, until the staying shut is not a choice anymore, but a habit worn so deep. It feels like the shape of the world. The scar had been his reason at first, or his excuse. He had gone into society once early and seen the faces, the flinch, the pity, the pretty woman who had gone white and turned away. He had understood that the world he had been born to would receive him now only as a curiosity or a horror, and he had decided he would not be received at all. But the scar was not truly the reason, and in his more honest hours, which came at night, he knew it. The reason was the ghosts. The reason was Tim's and the others, and the plain fact that he had lived, and they had not. A man who has watched better men than himself die in the mud has no business laughing ever again at anything. So he had stopped, and the house had stopped with him, as houses do. The tarn below the windows had gone on, holding the gray sky and its black water year after year, still and cold and closed. That had been his life. He had expected it to be his life until it ended, which he did not much care how soon. And now there was a woman in his library who had looked at the ruin of his face and talked to him about surgeons. She was there the next morning, and the morning after, and she did not go away. She worked. That was the thing that undid him in the end, though it took a long while, and he fought it the whole way. She did not sit with him and draw him out. His mother had tried that in the early years, sending up a succession of gentle companions hired to be soft at him until he fled the room, and he had fled everyone. Selena Radam did nothing of the kind. She simply worked all day at the saving of his library, with her sleeves turned back and a smudge of mold on her jaw, and she left him alone unless she wanted something. What she wanted was usually hands. Within the first week, she had the whole household at her command. She had got it not by rank, for she had none, but by knowing what she was about. Selena understood damp. She had kept a naval captain's house on a wet coast for years, and she knew that you do not simply dry a book. You dry the air around it slowly, or the covers crack, and the pages cockle worse than before. So she set the frightened servants to work in a system, and the system was so plainly sensible that they stopped being frightened. She had the braziers set at a distance, and moved by the hour, never close enough to scorch. She had the worst books stood open like little tents down the middle of the long table, spine up to let the air walk through them. She trained 2 housemaids in an afternoon to lift a spoiled binding without tearing it. She set a footman to turning the cracked globe a quarter each day so that it dried true and did not warp further along its seam. She named a task for each pair of hands and thanked each pair when the task was done. By the end of the week, the servants of South Tarn, who had crept about a dead house for 10 years, doing as little as they dared, were following her from shelf to shelf like ducklings. They argued among themselves over who should have the saving of the good calf bindings. They were proud of the work because she had shown them the work was worth being proud of. The Duke watched it from his chair. He told himself he came to the library each day to guard his property. He knew that he lied. He came to watch a competent woman do difficult work well, because he had not seen anyone do anything well, or care about doing it well, in 10 years, and the sight of it was like water to a man who had not known he was thirsty. She had a way of speaking to him that no one else had. She did not defer, she did not coddle, and she did not, above all, pity. He had grown so used to pity that he could no longer tell it from kindness, and had rejected both together for 10 years as the same soft, insulting thing. Selena gave him neither. He was short with her in those early weeks. Often it was the only weapon he had left, and he used it clumsily, the way a man uses a tool he is ashamed of. One gray morning she asked him where the estate papers were kept because the accounts were in a disgrace, and she meant to mend them. He answered without turning his head in the flat, cold voice he kept for the world. The accounts were not her concern, he said, and she would do well to remember what she had been hired for. I was hired by your mother, said Selena, unhurried, to put this house in order, and a house is its accounts before it is anything else. But I see you are in a temper this morning, so I shall ask you again tomorrow when you are not. And you will tell me then, because you are a reasonable man under all of that. And reasonable men do not let their houses rot, despite their mothers past the first week. And she went back to her books. She did not look to see how he took it. She left him sitting in his chair with nothing to push against, because she had simply declined to be pushed. She asked him again the next morning. He told her where the papers were. It became without either of them naming it the way of things between them. She waited out his tempers the way one waits out weather, without fear and without offense, and then went on exactly where she had left off. And he found, to his confusion, and then to something he would not yet let himself call relief, that a man cannot long enjoy being cruel to a person who declines to be wounded by it. The cruelty had been a wall. She simply walked through it every day as though it were not there, until he began to wonder why he had built it. It was the accounts that first drew him out of his chair, for a reason other than to watch her. She had asked for the estate papers, and he had given them, and she had taken them to the long library table, and gone through them the way she went through everything, patiently, thoroughly, and with a growing indignation. She did not trouble to hide, for she found, as she had half expected, that a house left to itself for 10 years is not merely a house neglected, it is a house robbed. The Duke's agent, a comfortable man in the market town, had drawn his salary for a decade and earned none of it. He had let the whole estate slide, and had let it slide in the particular way that lines an idle agent's pockets. Good timber sold, and the money not fully accounted, rents collected late or not at all, the arrears written off rather than pursued, because pursuing them was work. 2 farms standing empty that could have been let, a drainage rate paid for years on land the old Duke had drained long before that needed it no longer. It was not grand thievery. It was the small, steady seepage of an estate with no eye on it. Over 10 years it came to a sum that made Selena set down her pen and sit still. She did not go to the agent. She went to the Duke. "You are being robbed," she said plainly, laying the papers before his chair. Not greatly, and not by a villain, only by a comfortable man who understood long ago that no one was watching. "I have marked it all here. It is a great deal of money over 10 years. And more to the point, it is a great deal of your own land gone slack, and your own tenants gone sour, because a tenant who has never visited and never helped soon stops caring for ground he thinks no one else cares for either." He looked at the papers a long moment. She went on, "I can put the papers right in a month, but I cannot put the land right. Only you can do that. It is yours, and it wants its master, not its master's hired widow with a ledger. You could have simply mended the accounts," he said. "It is what my mother hired you for. You need not have shown me any of this." "I could," Selena agreed, "and you would have gone on sitting in that chair while a stranger set your house to rights around you. It would have been one more thing done to you, rather than by you. And you have had 10 years of things done to you. I did not think another would help. Ride out with me tomorrow. See your own land. It has missed you, land does." And the next morning, for the first time in 10 years, the Duke of Elmsford rode out over his own estate, with a plain widow beside him on a borrowed cob. He looked at the empty farms, and the slack rents, and the sour tenants, and he began slowly, stiffly, like a man using a limb long unused to be a duke again. It did not come back to him all at once. At the first farm they stopped at, the tenant, an old man named Sorby, who had farmed there under the Duke's father, came out wiping his hands, and did not know his own landlord, and then knew him, and did not know what to say. For the Duke had been a rumor in his own valley for 10 years, a scarred ghost up at the great house that no one saw. There was an awkward silence, and then Selena plainly asked Sowerby about his barn roof, which she had marked in the accounts as unrepaired these 6 years. The old man's face changed. Here, at last, was someone from the great house who knew the state of his roof, and seemed to think it mattered. He began to talk, the Duke listened, and before they rode on, he had promised the man his slates, and meant it. Sawa stood in his yard and watched them go with an expression Selena had seen on the faces of the house servants her first week, the cautious, disbelieving beginning of hope. It went so far by farm through that long morning. The valley began slowly to understand that its master had come back to it, and the valley which had been sour began slowly to sweeten. In the evenings, at first, he did not come. He took a tray in the old wing and sat alone as he had for 10 years. But the library was warm now, with its braziers and its new fires, and it was the only warm room in the house. And a cold man is drawn to warmth, whatever his intentions. So he began to come. He would sit in his chair by the hearth with a book he did not read on the far side of the room, and she would work on at the long table, and neither of them would speak for an hour together. And it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people, each glad, and neither willing to say so, of not being alone. One such evening she was cataloguing by candlelight, murmuring the titles half aloud as she wrote them, and she came upon a book he had not thought of in years, a book of his boyhood, and she read the title out into the quiet room. "That was my father's," he said, before he could stop himself, that it had been his father's, and that he had hated it as a boy, and loved it as a man, which was the way of most things his father gave him. It was the first thing he had told her of himself that was not forced out of him. She only nodded and wrote it down, and did not make anything of it, and went on to the next. But he noticed that she set that book aside, apart from the others, on the corner of the table nearest his chair, where he might reach it. She said nothing about that either. He turned it over in his hands for a long while after she had gone up, and did not read it, and could not have said why the sight of it, set aside for him without a word, had loosened something in his chest. The first time she made him laugh, she was not trying to. That was the whole of why it worked. It was some weeks in. The library was half saved. She was up a ladder, reaching for a high shelf, when Mrs. Peel came to the door in a state of anxious flutter, to announce that the vicar had called. The vicar called once a quarter, out of grim duty, and sat in dreadful silence for the correct 20 minutes, and left. It was a visit both men loathed, and neither would end. The Duke from his chair said in the flat, weary voice he used for the whole business of his own life, that Mrs. Peel might tell the vicar he was not at home. "He knows you are at home," said Selena from the top of the ladder, not turning round. "You are always at home. You have been at home for 10 years. It is the least convincing lie in the north of England. The poor man has to pretend to believe it 4 times a year, which is surely penance enough for whatever he did to deserve this parish." She reached for the next book. "Let him in, give him a decent glass of something, and ask him about his roof. A vicar's roof is always failing, and he will talk about it for 20 minutes, and you need say nothing at all. It is far less trouble than the lie, and it has the advantage of being kind, which the lie is not." There was a silence, and then it came out of him before he could stop it, before he even knew it was coming. A real laugh, short and rough, and rusty as an unused hinge, dragged up from somewhere he had bricked over 10 years before. It astonished him more than it astonished her. He put his hand to his mouth, to the scarred side, as though to catch it or hide it. The laugh pulled the old wound tight, and made the smile beneath it, crooked and strange, half a face laughing, and half a face that had forgotten how. Nor he sat there with his hand over his mouth, and his slate eyes wide above it, appalled and amazed. A man who was heard a sound in an empty house and realized it was his own voice. Selena came down the ladder. She looked at him, and she did not make anything of it, which was the kindest thing she could have done. She understood without being told that a thing had happened that must not be remarked upon, or it would never happen again. "The vicar," she said, "the roof, go on. I shall be here mending your books, and I promise to look very busy, so that he thinks you have serious estate business, and cannot be spared for long." And the Duke of Elmsford, still shaken, rose and went and received his vicar, and asked him about his roof. The poor, astonished clergyman talked about it for 25 minutes. It was the least dreadful visit the two of them had shared in a decade. Afterward, the Duke stood a long time at his study window, looking down at the black, still tarn, and put his fingers again to the scarred corner of his mouth, where the ghost of the laugh still seemed to sit. He did not know whether he wanted to weep or to do it again. That was the beginning of the Thor, and like all true Thors, it did not run smooth. Ice that has stood 10 years does not go out of a tarn in a day. It groans and cracks and refreezes in the cold nights and heaves. There were days after that first laugh when the Duke was worse than he had ever been, colder, harder, more determined to drive her out, precisely because she had reached him, and it frightened him past bearing. This was the wound itself, fighting for its life, though neither of them would have called it that. The wound had kept him safe for 10 years. Safe in the way a locked room is safe, and it did not mean to be unlocked, and it used every weapon it had. Its weapons were all turned inward. The morning after the vicar, he did not come to the library at all. He sent word by Mrs. Peel that Mrs. Radam was to confine herself to the books, and not to trouble the rest of the house, which she had lately begun to set in order room by room. It was a small, cold cruelty, and Selena understood it exactly for what it was. He had laughed, and now he was ashamed of it, and he was punishing them both. She sent word back by the same trembling housekeeper that she quite understood and would confine herself to the books. She added that the room next, the small parlor, was letting in nearly as much water as the library had, and would spoil its paneling within the month if it were left, but that she would of course not trouble it, since she had been forbidden the rest of the house. Then she went on with her work. By afternoon he had come to the door of the library himself. He stood in it stiff and grim, and said that she might see to the small parlor after all. She thanked him gravely, as though the matter were settled between reasonable people, and did not smile, though she wished to, because she had won a skirmish he did not yet know they were fighting, which was the skirmish for his own life, and she meant to win it without ever letting him feel beaten. The house began to come back with him. That was the strange grace of it, and Selena, who had not planned it, watched it happen with a quiet wonder. As the Duke thawed, south, he gave the orders now, or she suggested, and he gave them. The covers came off the rooms one by one. Fires were lit in hearths that had been cold for a decade. The moss was scraped from the north walls, and the weeds pulled from the sweep. Men came up from the village to mend what 10 years had broken. The great dead house began room by room to breathe. It was as though the master and the house were one creature, which, in a sense, they had always been, and could not revive apart. Selena found she could measure his recovery by the house. She could tell what kind of night he had had by whether he ordered the east shutters opened. She could read the state of his heart in the state of his rooms, and she did not tell him she read him so, because a man newly learning to live again must be allowed to think himself unobserved. There was a night that first spring when the state of things showed itself plainly. A ewe was down in the home pasture lambing badly, and the shepherd was old and his hands were stiff, and the farmer's boy came up to the house half in tears because the ewe would die and the lambs with her. In the old days no one would have dreamed of troubling the Duke. But Selena was in the hall when the boy came, and she did not hesitate, and she called for lanterns, and went out into the wet dark herself, because she had lambed ewes before on the wet coast, and a life is a life. She did not ask the Duke to come, but he came. She heard him behind her on the path and did not remark on it, and the two of them knelt in the straw of the cold byre by lantern light for the better part of an hour, and between them, they turned the lamb and brought it living into the world, and its twin after it. The Duke's hands were good at it, better than hers, steady and unhurried, and she saw that a man who has learned to do a hard, bloody thing under fire does not forget the steadiness of it. When the lambs were up and butting for the teat, he sat back on his heels in the straw with blood to his elbows and looked at them. The two small living things he had helped into the world, and something moved in his scarred face that she had not seen there before. Not laughter, something older and quieter, the look of a man who has spent 10 years dealing only in death, and has just with his own hands done the opposite. "You are good at that," she said plainly, wiping her hands. "You should do it often. There is a great deal of living work on an estate this size, and you have let others do all of it for 10 years, and I think it has not been good for you. Doing no living work." He looked at her across the lantern light. "You say things," he said slowly, "that no one else would dare." "I know," said Selena. "It is my chief fault, my husband used to say, though he also said it was my chief virtue on the days it suited him." She rose and shook the straw from her skirts. "Come, you are covered in blood, and so am I. And Mrs. Peel will have hot water, and in the morning there will be 2 lambs alive that would have been dead. And that is a good night's work, whatever else is true." And the Duke of Elmsford, who had not done a good night's work in 10 years, rose and followed her up to the house through the wet dark, and did not feel that night quite so much like a ghost. After the night with the lambs, something in him softened, loosening its grip just a little further. He found himself in the library each evening now, not with the pretense of reading, but simply sitting by the fire, close to her. Sometimes they spoke, and sometimes they didn't, and the silences had become as comfortable between them as conversation. One evening, as she was absorbed in her book, a fierce wind howled across the fells, and a shutter somewhere above had come loose, banging relentlessly. She noticed him flinch at the sound. It was a small, sharp recoil, quickly suppressed, the instinctive flinch of a man for whom a sudden noise would, for the rest of his life, always conjure the report of a gun. She didn't comment. She simply rose, wordlessly, went to find the offending shutter, secured it, and returned to her book without a word. He, too, remained silent, but he watched her every movement across the room and back, and a vulnerability, unguarded and soft, had settled upon his face. She had understood his flinch without him having to utter a word, and had remedied its cause without him needing to name it. In 10 years, no one had offered him such a simple, quiet mercy. He didn't thank her. He knew she wouldn't want thanks, but that night, as she rose to retire, he stood as she passed his chair, a gesture he hadn't made before. It was a small thing, a courtesy any gentleman would extend to a lady. Between them, however, it was far from small, and they both knew it, though neither spoke of it. The most telling sign of his return was the children. There was a tenant's child, a small, solemn girl of about 6 named Nan, the daughter of the man who managed the home farm. She held no trace of the fear that the elders felt for the great, scarred, silent Duke, for she was too young to have been taught it. One warm afternoon, she had wandered up to the house in pursuit of a stray lamb and stumbled upon the Duke in the slowly reviving garden. She didn't flee. Instead, she planted herself squarely before him, gazing up at the long scar with frank, childish curiosity, and asked, without a hint of cruelty, if it had hurt. The Duke hadn't spoken to a child in a decade. He found himself crouching down to her level. "It hurt very much at the time," he said, his voice grave. "But it doesn't hurt anymore. It only looks as though it does." Nan considered this with great seriousness. Then, she informed him that she, too, had a scar on her knee from a gate, and proudly showed it to him, tugging up her stocking to reveal a small white mark no bigger than a barleycorn. The Duke examined it with equal gravity and pronounced it a very fine scar, quite as good as his own, which delighted her immensely. Then, having settled the matter of scars, she enlisted him, with the ruthless efficiency of the very young, to help her catch her lamb. Selena watched the entire scene unfold from the library window, unseen. She watched the Duke of Elmsford chase a lamb around his own reviving garden, directed by a 6-year-old. She watched him finally corner it against the wall, catch it, and hand it to the child. And she watched him, once the lamb was safely returned, lift Nan up so she could see over the wall at something she wanted to point out. His scarred face, for once, was utterly unself-conscious, turned up to the small, serious girl, radiating a warmth that 10 years of society had never once been allowed to witness. Selena had to sit down. The sight of it had done something to her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in 7 years and had thought she would never feel again. That was the day she understood she was in danger. And being a woman of sense, she named the danger to herself, plainly, alone that night, refusing to pretend it was anything other than what it was. She was falling in love with him, not pitying him, which was something she had never done, nor mothering him, which he didn't need and she would never have offered. To love him, the difficult, thawing, half-scarred, slowly reviving man he was. The dry, rusty laugh she had coaxed out of him, the grave gentleness he showed a farm child, the ghosts he carried, and the courage it took him, more courage than the battle that had scarred him, to open a single shutter. And loving him was a danger, because Selena Radam had built her fierce independence, plank by plank, from the wreckage of her widowhood. She had come to value it above comfort, above company, above almost anything. To love a man, to bind herself again, and above all, to bind herself to a duke, to a title and a great house, and the whole ponderous apparatus of a world that would scrutinize and judge her, was to risk the one thing she had sworn, after her husband's death, she would never risk again, the sovereignty of her own life. She had been a wife once. She had been, even in a good marriage, something that belonged to someone. She had promised herself she would never be that again, and here she was, in a reviving house in the northern fells, in danger of promising the very opposite. She did not run from it. That was not her way. But she did not act on it either. Not yet. The choice, if it was to be made, was one she intended to make with her eyes wide open, in her own time, on her own terms, not to stumble into like a girl. The world, which had forgotten the Duke of Elmsford for 10 years, remembered him again that summer, as the world does, at the worst possible moment. A cousin of his arrived from the north. He was a smooth, pleasant, fashionable man named Mr. Aldous Sarn, who stood next in line to the dukedom should the duke die without an heir, and who had spent 10 years quietly hoping the recluse at South Tarn would oblige him by doing so. He had heard, through the servant's grapevine that runs faster than any post, that a woman had come to the house, and that the duke had been seen to speak, and even to laugh. Mr. Sarn did not care for the sound of it at all. A duke who laughs is a duke who might marry. A duke who marries might have an heir. So Mr. Sarn came north, all cousinly concern, to see how things stood. He was pleasant to Selena in a way that was worse than rudeness. He complimented her competence as one compliments a good upper servant. He wondered aloud, smiling, how fortunate his poor cousin was to have found a woman willing to bury herself in such a place, for such a purpose at her age. And over dinner, which the Duke endured for the first time in years, for the sake of not seeming driven from his own table, Mr. Sarn turned the talk gently and cruelly to the past, to the ball there had been at South the last summer before Spain, to how gay the Duke had been then, how handsome, how sought after before. He let the word before hang in the air. He looked once, with pleasant sorrow, at the scar, and said how glad he was to see his cousin so much recovered. Though, of course, he added, a man in the Duke's position, with the succession to think of, must consider his duty carefully, and could not be expected to form any connection that was not in every particular suitable. The Duke had gone very still and very cold. Selena saw the old shadow descend over him, the shadow she had spent months lifting, and she saw the wound flare up within him at the word suitable, telling him again all the things it had told him for 10 years, that he was a ruin, that any woman near him must be after his rank or moved by his pity, that he had no business wanting. Selena set down her glass. "Mr. Sarn," she said, pleasantly, "you have said a great deal about your cousin's duty and his position, and what is suitable, and you have looked twice at his face while you said it, thinking I did not notice. So let me be plain, as I generally am, because I find it saves time. You did not come north out of concern for your cousin. You came because you heard he might live and marry and get an heir, and you have spent 10 years preferring that he do none of those things, because if he does none of them, the whole of this passes to you. That is not a wicked thing to hope. It is only a human thing. But it is a poor reason to sit at a man's table and remind him sweetly of everything the war took from him. I have nursed better men than you and buried them, and I know the difference between concern and appetite. You may finish your dinner, but you will not do that again while I am at this table, because I will not sit still for it. And I am, as you have observed, past the age of caring what a man like you thinks of me." There was a ringing silence. Mr. Sarn's pleasant face had gone quite white, and the Duke of Elmsford, at the head of his own table, looked at Selena Radam as though he had never truly seen her before. No one had ever defended him. In 10 years, no one had ever once stood between him and the world's soft cruelty, and simply refused to let it pass. He had defended himself when he could, with silence and distance. He had never had a champion, and here was one, in a made-over gown, telling his heir to his face to mind his manners, and past the age of caring, who knew it. Mr. Sarn left in the morning, and that night, for the first time, the Duke did not merely endure Selena's company. He sought it. He found her in the library, and did not sit in his usual far chair. He drew a chair to the fire, near hers, and sat. For a while, he said nothing. Then, he told her the thing he had told no one. He told her about Spain, Not the version he gave the world, the clean version, the cavalry action, the wound. He told her the true version, in the low, halting voice of a man speaking words he had kept behind his teeth for 10 years. He told her about the boy Timms, 19 years old, whose mother he had promised to see him safe. He told her how the boy had ridden at his left hand that afternoon, frightened, and how he had told him it would be all right, because that is what one tells frightened boys, and how the same saber stroke that opened his own face had killed the boy a moment later, so that he had lived and the boy had died, on the strength of a hand's breadth of chance and nothing else. He told her about the letter he had written to the boy's mother, and how he had not been able to make it true, and how he had never gone to see her in 10 years because he could not stand in front of her having lived when her son had not. He told her that he had stopped laughing because it seemed a theft, that every hour of ease he took felt stolen from men who would never take another, that he had thought, coming north, that if he shut himself away and took no pleasure and let the house rot around him, it would be a kind of loyalty, a keeping faith with the dead. Selena listened to the whole of it plainly, without flinching, as she listened to everything. She did not fill his silences. She did not offer comfort he had not asked for. She let him lay the whole of it before her, the wound behind the wound, and she did not turn away from any of it. And when he had finished, and sat spent and shaking a little in the firelight, having emptied out 10 years into the quiet room, she did not tell him it was not his fault, which he would not have believed, or that time would heal it, which was a lie. She said, "You did not steal your life from Timms. A saber stroke that misses by a hand's breadth is not a theft. It is only the world being what it is, cruel and blind and caring nothing for our deserving. You have spent 10 years punishing yourself for the crime of surviving, as though your misery could be paid across to the dead like a debt. It cannot. Timms is not warmer for your cold, nor safer for your grief, nor less dead for your never laughing. The dead ask nothing of us, Dominic. It is the living who need us. And there is a woman in the south of England who lost her boy, and to whom you have never gone because you could not bear it. I will tell you plainly, your not going has spared her nothing, and cost her the one man alive who could tell her that her son was brave and was loved and did not die alone. You owe her that. You do not owe the dead your ruin. You owe the living your courage. It is harder. That is why you have chosen the ruin. It is easier to sit in the dark than to go and stand in front of a grieving mother and be looked at. But you are not a coward, whatever you have told yourself these 10 years, and I think you know the difference, and I think it is time you did the harder thing. It was the first time she had used his name, Dominic. She had not planned to. It had come out of her with the truth, as her truths did, without leave, and he heard it land in the quiet room, and he did not correct her, and neither of them remarked on it, but something in the using of it had changed the air between them, and they both knew it. He went south within the month. It was the hardest thing he had done since the war, harder than the war, and he told her so before he went, standing in the hall with his gloves in his hand and his face gray. She did not tell him it would be easy. She told him it would be hard, and that he would do it anyway, because he was not a coward, and that she would see to the house while he was gone. And he went. He stood in front of the boy's mother, a small, worn woman in a small, clean cottage, and was looked at, and did not flinch from the looking. He told her that her son had ridden at his left hand, and had been brave and had been loved by the men, and had not died alone or afraid, and that the fault of his dying was no one's but the war's. He gave her the boy's watch which he had carried 10 years and never been able to send. He stayed 3 days. He mended her roof with his own hands because it wanted mending, and he found he could not sit still in the same room as her grief without doing some small useful thing with it. And when he came away, she held his scarred face between her 2 old hands, and thanked him, and forgave him the thing he had never been able to forgive himself, which was that he had lived, and it was the beginning of his being able at last to forgive it too. He came back to South Tarn, changed, lighter, as a man is lighter, who has set down a thing he has carried 10 years. He came, Selena understood, not only back to the house, but back toward her, though neither of them yet said so. But a wound that has ruled a man for 10 years does not give up its ground without a last stand. The closer he came to her, the harder, for a time, it fought. There was a fortnight late in that summer when he drew back from her again. It was the old pattern, and she knew it by now. But it was worse this time, because there was more to lose. He had let her see the whole of him in the firelight, the night of Tim's. And a man who has shown another the whole of himself is never so frightened as in the days after. So the wound rose in him and told him its oldest lie, the one it had told him for 10 years, and told him now with a new and specific cruelty. It told him that a whole woman, sound and capable and free, could not truly want a half-ruined man. That if she stayed, it must be from duty, or from the softness of a kind heart, or from the habit of tending broken things, that the only honorable thing was to send her away before she woke one morning, and understood what she had bound herself to. He grew formal with her. He spoke of the work as nearly finished. He said, one gray afternoon in the flat voice she had not heard in weeks, that she must not feel obliged to remain at South Tarn the summer, that he would see her handsomely settled, that a woman of her parts should not bury herself in the fells on his account. Selena put down her pen. She looked at him a long moment, and there was no hurt in her face, only the level understanding that was worse than hurt, because it saw straight through him. You are frightened again, she said. It was not a question, and it was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis delivered in the plain, unbothered voice of a woman who has nursed a great many frightened men and lost her fear of their tempers long ago. You let me see the whole of you, and it terrified you, and now you have decided the safest thing is to send me off before I can leave you first. I understand it. I will not do it. She rose. She was not a tall woman, and he was a tall man, and she looked up at him without the smallest fear. I am not staying out of duty. I have no duty to you. Your mother hired me for a library, and the library is nearly saved, and I am free to go tomorrow. I am not staying from softness either. I am not a soft woman, as you have had ample cause to learn. If I stay, and I have not yet said that I will, it will be because I have looked at you with my eyes open and chosen to. You cannot frighten me out of a choice I have not yet made. So you may as well stop trying, and let us both wait like grown people to see what I decide. He stared at her, and the wound which had ruled him 10 years felt the ground go soft beneath it. There is no weapon in all its armory that works against a person who declines calmly to be managed by fear. He did not send her away. He could not. He had met at last a strength greater than his grief, and it was not trying to defeat him. It was only waiting for him to be brave enough to be happy. The estate revived through that summer as he revived. The last of the covers came off. The gardens were cut back and began tentatively to remember what they had been. And through it all, there was one room Selena had not been permitted to touch. One door in the south front that stayed shut, its shutters closed, and she did not force it, because she had learned that some doors a man must open himself, or not at all. He opened it in high summer, on a long gold evening, and he took her with him. He took her without a word of explanation, along the south front to the shut door. He stood before it, and for a moment he could not open it, and she waited because she had learned to wait. And at last he opened it, and they went in together into the dark, and he crossed to the windows, and with hands that were not quite steady, opened the shutters one by one. The summer evening light came flooding into the long room, and Selena saw. It was a ballroom, or it had been a long, beautiful gallery with a floor made for dancing, a musician's gallery at the far end, and tall windows looking down the valley to the town. It was the one room in the house that neglect had not touched, because it had been shut and sealed and left exactly as it was. It stood now like a room inside a held breath, the last room of his old life preserved. Chairs were still set against the walls as if for a gathering. In the great cold hearth lay the gray ashes of a fire 10 years dead. The last time I laughed, the Duke said, standing in the flooding light with the long, unused room before him. Before the vicar was in this room, there was a ball here the summer before I went to Spain. The last of the old life. I danced in this room, and I laughed, and I was a fool, and I was happy, and I did not know it, which is the way of it. He turned to her. The summer light was on the ruined side of his face, on the long silver scar, and his slate eyes were wet and unashamed of it. When I came back, I could not enter it. I shut it up. I could not bear to see the place where that man had been happy, knowing what became of him. I have not crossed this threshold in 10 years. He looked at the room and then at her. I do not know why I have crossed it now. He said that is not true. I know exactly why. Because of you. I have done every difficult thing of these last months because of you. I am telling you this badly, for I am 10 years out of practice at telling anyone anything. But I would rather tell you badly than not at all. You came into my dead house and you did not flinch. You did not pity me. You saved my books. You made me laugh. You gave me back the name of a boy I could not say aloud for 10 years. And you sent me south to his mother. And you defended me at my own table to a man who wished me dead. Somewhere in the doing of it, you have made me want to live, which I had given up wanting. I do not know how to say what that is, except to say that I love you, and that I have no right to, and that I am telling you anyway, in this room, where the last happy man I ever was, danced the summer before the world ended. It was the longest speech of his life, and it cost him more than the saber had. And Selena Radam stood in the flooding light of the reopened ballroom, and understood that the choice she had promised to make, with her eyes open, had come to her, and that she was ready. She did not fall into his arms. That was not her way, and he would not, she knew, have wanted a thing so easily got. She stood where she was, and looked at the whole of him, the scar, and the man, and the 10 years, and the wet slate eyes, and she made her choice aloud herself first, plainly, because she was a woman who named her terms. I want you to understand what I am about to do, she said, and her voice was steady, because I do not do it lightly, and I will not have you think I do. I am a widow. I have been my own woman for 7 years, beholden to no one, mistress of my own small life. I have valued that more than I can easily tell you, because I earned it out of grief, plank by plank, and I swore I would never give it up. To choose you is to give up a great deal of it. It is to become a duchess, which I do not want. It is to be looked at and judged and managed by a world I have spent 7 years keeping at arm's length. I have counted the cost of it carefully, because I count the cost of everything. It is how I have survived, and I have decided that I will pay it. She stepped toward him across the dancing floor. I choose you, Dominic, not because you need me, though you do, not because I pity you, which I have never done, but because I have looked at you as clearly as I have ever looked at anything, and I see a man worth the whole cost, and more. I would rather be less free beside you than wholly free without you. There. I have said it first and plainly, and I meant every word. Now you may stop looking so astonished, and answer me because I have just given up my sovereignty for you, and the least you can do is not stand there gaping like the vicar. And the Duke of Elmsford laughed. It came out of him full and unforced and whole, the second true laugh of his new life. And this time he did not put his hand over his mouth to catch it or hide it. He let it come, crooked scar and all, half a face laughing freely, and half a face doing its best. It filled the long reopened ballroom where the last laugh of his old life had died. It was not a theft from the dead, and he knew it now. He knew it at last. He crossed the floor to her, the dancing floor of his ruined youth, and took her plain, capable hands in his, and said her name, which he had not once said aloud, Selena, and it was a vow, and she gave him his, Dominic, first spoken across a ruined library, and now spoken here, as a promise. The summer light came down the valley, off the black tarn, and filled the room. There was no ghost in it anymore, only the two of them, and the dust, and the light. They were married before the summer ended, quietly in the small gray church at the foot of the valley. The Duchess sat in the front pew, looking as though she had arranged the whole of it, which in a sense she had. Selena wore not the widow's greys she had worn for 7 years, but a gown the color of the summer fells, chosen by herself on her own terms. It was the last free act of the free woman she had been, and the first glad act of the woman she chose to become. She shed the greys for good that day, and did not miss them. The wound did not leave him. That was never the way of it, and Selena had never expected or wished it. The scar remained, silver down his cheek, pulling his smile always a little out of true. There were nights, still when he woke with the mud and the screaming, and the boy Tim's in his eyes. On those nights she did not try to cure him, because some things are not curable, only bearable, and bearable is enough. She only lay beside him in the dark, and let him not be alone in it, which was the one thing that helped, and the only thing she had ever offered. And as the morning broke, the fells stood sentinel, the house hummed with life, and the day's work, rich and full, awaited. There was a vast amount of living to be done, and they faced it together. He was a duke once more, truly embracing his inheritance, traversing his lands in any weather. She, meanwhile, managed the household, the accounts, and between their efforts, South began to bloom again. Its farms were leased, its tenants welcomed, its rents fairly collected, its rooms aglow with warmth. Little Nan, a whirlwind of a child, became a permanent fixture, forever underfoot, and the Duke, who hadn't spoken to a child in a decade, found himself unable to refuse her anything. He taught her to ride. He allowed her to call him by a name no Duke had ever been called, and he didn't flinch. Then, in the 2nd year, the boy's mother, a small, weathered woman from a southern cottage, journeyed north to visit. She stayed for a fortnight, sitting by the fire with Selena while the Duke was away. The 2 women spoke of their lost ones, the sailor and the soldier, with a quiet fortitude, not with tears, but with the weary acceptance of those who have carried grief for a long time and found a measure of peace in the journey. The departed were not absent from that house. They were simply, at last, allowed to rest within its walls, spoken of, honored, and no longer hidden away, a request the dead make, and all the living can grant. The ballroom, too, saw use again, not often, and never ostentatiously, for neither of them were grand people, and the fells lie far from the bustle of the world. Yet, once or twice a year, the long gallery would be thrown open and illuminated, and the county would make its way up the shadowed valley in their carriages. Music would fill the musicians' gallery, and dancing would grace the floor where he had once, long ago, been the happiest man alive. The Duke could no longer dance with ease, his leg, like his face, bearing the marks of past injury. He stood at the periphery, his scarred countenance and slate-gray eyes fixed on his wife as she navigated the dance figures. He felt no sting of regret that he couldn't join her. Between each dance, she would deliberately return to his side, a silent declaration to the room that they belonged to each other, that they had chosen this shared existence, and he would laugh. That was what the county whispered about, what spread like wildfire across the fells and down to the towns, the strangest news in years. The scarred, reclusive Duke of Elmsford, silent for a decade, now laughed often, a rough, lopsided, almost broken sound that somehow warmed every corner of the room. His laughter was most frequent when his Duchess spoke her plain, unvarnished truths, the kind she had never learned to temper. He laughed not because she aimed to amuse him, she never did, but precisely because she didn't, because she continued, throughout her life, to speak to him with the same unadorned honesty she had shown him across a decaying library on a bleak winter morning. And the truth, spoken plainly by the one person who had never once feared him, was the most amusing, the most cherished, and the most healing thing he knew. On the last still evening of that first married summer, they walked down together to the Tarn. The small, deep, black lake had mirrored the unmoving gray sky for all 10 of those closed years. It was no longer black. The low sun bathed it, and it held the sky's gold and the fells green, and the 2 of them at its edge. A gentle breeze rippled the water, releasing its held breath at last, the entire surface stirring and alive. Selena gazed at the tarn, then at the reviving house above it, and finally at the man beside her, the scar, the slate eyes, the crooked, healing smile. She said nothing, for some things are best conveyed in silence, and he understood her silence, having finally learned to read her as she had always read him. The house had waited a long time. Houses can, and so it turns out, can men. If someone finally arrives who is unafraid to fling open the shutters, who cherishes what can be salvaged, who speaks the truth, who laughs with them, not at them, and who chooses them, plainly and first, with eyes wide open in the ruined ballroom of their old lives, bathed in the flooding summer light.